Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. A new coronavirus originating in Wuhan, China, has killed 9 people and has caused more than 400 people to fall ill. As the virus spreads and creates global alarm, on today's show, we take a look at what we know so far about this virus and how damaging can it prove to be if not taken control of. Joining us for this discussion is Dr. Amesh, who is a senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins University Center for Health Security. His work is focused on emerging infectious diseases, pandemic preparedness, and biosecurity. He joins us from New York. Also joining us is Mr. Joseph Cheng, who's an analyst from Hong Kong, and Mr. Klaus Jurgens, an analyst from Brighton. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to the show. Now, Dr. Amesh, Adalja, let me begin with you. What do we know so far about the nature of this new virus?
Well, we know this is a coronavirus that hadn't been known to infect humans before this outbreak. We know that it is spreading from person to person. We don't know the degree to which that happens, how frequent it happens, if it's rare or if it's common. And we know that it has the ability to cause severe disease, at least in some patients. But we don't know the full scope of its severity yet. We don't know if most patients have a mild illness or if it falls closer to the SARS or MERS group of viruses within the coronavirus family.
Right. Now, Dr. Amesh, Adalja, you're mentioning the SARS and the MERS here. Now, a lot of people are drawing parallels or comparisons to it. Can you tell us the extent to which those viruses cause damage and the history associated to them, and why this virus specifically is causing such an outrage and such an alarm?
So before 2003, most people thought of coronaviruses as very mild infections that caused usually the common cold. But in 2003, a novel coronavirus, which is now known as the SARS coronavirus, appeared in China around this time of the year in this winter season and basically circled the globe, causing 8,000 infections and about 800 deaths. It led to mass disruptions in economic life, billions of dollars of economic losses, and it really reframed how people thought about coronaviruses, and that made coronaviruses kind of rise to the list of pathogens to think about when it comes to pandemics. And since that time, anytime a novel coronavirus appears, people really worry about its ability to spread like SARS, and that was definitely the case when MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, appeared in 2012 and 2013 in the Arabian Peninsula and also caused severe disease. But it hadn't spread in the way that SARS did, but it was another one of the coronaviruses that showed that they can do severe damage.
Right. Now, Mr. Cheng, as Dr. Adalja, talking about the fear that is associated to this coronavirus and the ones that came before it, why we're driving all that fear, what the situation is about. Can you tell us how widespread this disease has become? How many countries has it impacted so far?
Well, the Chinese leadership has just acknowledged the threat of the spread of the epidemic. And since it has been acknowledged by the top Chinese authorities, local city officials are now more ready to acknowledge that cases existed. Now, Wuhan is a big city in central China with very well-developed transport links north to Beijing, east to Shanghai, and south to the Pearl River Delta. Now, all these major cities connected to Wuhan have acknowledged that cases of the epidemic now exist. And according to reports, we have cases of such viruses in Hong Kong, Macau, Japan, Thailand, and very, very recently, one case spreading to the United States.
Right. And we're hearing about the spread of this. That is definitely, especially with the case in the United States just being confirmed a few hours ago, in fact, the fear that is surrounding this widespread of this and how fast it can move. On that point specifically, Mr. Klaus Jurgens, I'd like to ask you, what do you think are some of the measures that countries need to take when something like this, when a virus such as this, which the properties of which are still not completely confirmed, are still unknown? What security measures need to be amped up?
Yes, thank you for having me. First of all, maybe a totally different approach. I wish all those affected and impacted that their health will be restored as quickly as possible. And there were, of course, fatalities. So condolences go out to the families. I think global solidarity in a globalized world is really necessary. Now, on to the technicalities. It was announced only a short while ago that the UK has started monitoring flights to Heathrow Airport. There are actually 3 direct flights per week. Germany has said we are not installing fever controls at Frankfurt Airport for the time being because there are no direct flights. But, for example, Rome and Paris have direct flights. So here in Europe, people are indeed worried but not yet panicking. But everyone understands the seriousness. As my esteemed colleague said, viruses like this can spread so easily in an interconnected world where everyone is traveling. What I understand is the health systems and hospitals are on the alert. But this brings me to my second technical point. We must be honest, of course. Some countries, even in Europe, are simply better prepared than others if an emergency would occur. So there must be a coordinated effort from the EU and, of course, the World Health Organization. Personally speaking, I think a travel ban should, at least for the time being, not be issued. There should be no drastic measures of controlling movement. And now let's go back to China. On the 25th, the big annual holiday is about to occur, and people are looking forward to visit family. They save for an entire year to buy plane or train or bus tickets. Now it will be a huge test for the Chinese authorities, not only to handle this huge flow of people, but at the same time keep an eye on it. Is this virus spreading? Do we have new cases? So all in all, a very complex situation, but as I've said, no panic here as of yet, but serious considerations. And coming back to Heathrow Airport, those passengers arriving on these potentially impacted flights are already administered, so to speak, and their passports checked in a separate area of the terminal. Now, this is a rather drastic measure, if I'm not wrong.
Right, but it seems like drastic measures are being carried out in order to be as proactive as possible given the situation. Mr. Joseph Cheng, now as we're talking about, and as Mr. Jurgens mentioned, it's the New Year in China that causes a massive amount of people coming in, going out. Give us an idea of the extent of the movement at this point in time.
Well, Saturday is the Chinese New Year Day. So people are going back to the families for family reunions, and it is estimated that maybe up to 100 million people will be traveling. The Chinese authorities have already identified the DNA order of the virus, so it facilitates rapid identification of the people affected. The most important thing is to put the health authorities and the city officials on the alert so that people who have a fever will have to report to the health authorities and be checked. And if they are affected by the virus, they have to be isolated and they have to be interned. And people have to be on the alert in general so that they are ready to report such cases. And of course, the general population has to adopt all types of basic hygiene measures like wearing masks, washing their hands frequently, cleaning up the facilities and so on. And apparently, this is being done. It has also been identified that the source of the virus comes from the wildlife markets in the seafood market in the Wuhan city.
Right. Mr. Cheng, I want to get to the source of this and what has happened after the source was identified, but I want to talk to Dr. Adalja about how can people be alert? What symptoms should they be on the lookout for?
So because coronaviruses are one of the more common causes of the common cold, many of the symptoms are going to be like the common cold. So that can include fever, cough, runny nose, sore throat, shortness of breath. And these symptoms can be very hard to distinguish from any other type of upper respiratory virus, including influenza. And we are in the midst of a pretty severe influenza season. So this is going to be very challenging to know which symptoms really are a concern for the novel coronavirus versus any other respiratory infection.
Right. And as Mr. Jurgens previously stated, and the World Health Organization is also set to meet and talk about the emergency of this situation. What type of emergency steps, coordinated steps at a global level do you think, Dr. Adalja, need to be taken or need to be considered?
There needs to be a consensus about what questions remain to be answered about this virus. And the answers to those questions will help gauge the risk and severity of this outbreak. So we need to understand, how common is this infection? What is its severity in terms of, are most people getting mild infections or are most people getting severe infections that require them to be hospitalized? We need to understand if this virus just appeared after these events in the market at the end of December, or was it circulating at some level before that and the market was just a clustered outbreak. We need to understand how efficiently it's spreading from human to human. We know that there is human-to-human spread, but we don't know how common that can be. And then we need to make sure that there are resources for diagnostic testing throughout the globe, that people have the ability to identify these cases and to care for them appropriately.
Right. Mr. Jurgens, just a last question to you. We see a lot of geopolitical tensions at different points in time, and even now, with all this information that Dr. Adalja is stressing on that needs to be transferred from place to place, there needs to be a coordinated effort. Can we be optimistic that on this, countries all over the world will make a coordinated effort?
Well, it's a very good point. Of course, there is from war to strife and upheaval in far too many countries around the world. There is, of course, a risk that some places, as I've mentioned before, are better prepared and ultimately better equipped. And I don't want to put it in any untoward terms, simply pay more attention because they have more time to focus on it. I think this is where the United Nations must step in, give clear guidelines, as my colleague said, what are the symptoms, and that everyone knows what are the symptoms and can distinguish between a flu. Secondly, funds must be earmarked and made available to all countries where the healthcare system is not as of yet to a world-class standard, that the diagnostics, as my esteemed colleague said, can actually be done there. So there's a huge task. The worst thing that could happen is to shrug it all off and say, well, this will ebb and wane away. It's like a tidal wave, and we are prepared, but we don't really care. I think this is a test not only for the United Nations, but for each country to focus on the well-being of their citizens. But yes, I have to be honest, as a political scientist and analyst, some countries are simply in a better position to fight it off, to take care of it. And here comes the United Nations into the foreground. Yes,
right.
Indeed.
And Mr. Jurgens, that's the point I'm going to end this segment on. That is one point that needs to be stressed on. Can be stressed on more, that this is the time for coordinated effort, and of course not just shrugging it off, being proactive and trying to take measures that are preventive and not reactionary. On that point, thank you so much, Mr. Klaus Jurgens, for joining us from London, Mr. Joseph Cheng for joining us from Hong Kong, and Dr. Amesh Adalja for joining us from New York. We're going to go for a short break, but when we come back, we take a look at the pressing agenda at the World Economic Forum this year. Inequality. Can Davos devise any meaningful outcomes? We'll discuss when we return. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. Now, as the world's political and business elite gather in the Swiss Alps to attend the World Economic Forum, at top of the agenda is inequality. Just to put into perspective the scale of inequality that exists today, women in rural parts of Africa spend 40 billion hours a year collecting water and yet remain in crippling poverty. But 22 of the world's richest men have more money than all of the women in Africa combined. Every year, all across the world, 1.3 billion tons of food is wasted, and yet 1 in 9 people go to bed hungry. And when we look at climate change, the richest 10% of people produce half of the Earth's climate-harming fossil fuel emissions, and yet the impact of climate change is felt by the poorest. Inequality is a multi-layered issue, but what more do we need to understand about the nature of this disparity? And is there a growing political will to address it? We try to answer these questions and more on today's show. Joining us for this discussion, Miss Vicky Pryce, who's an economist, joining us from London, Sam Relph, a journalist, joining us from Delhi, and Einar Tangen, an analyst, joining us from Beijing. Thank you all for joining us, and welcome to the show. Mr. Relph, let me begin with you. Now, we are seeing inequality at the forefront of the World Economic Forum. But do you think anything has significantly changed since all these business leaders, all these political elite met last time in Davos?
To some degree, yes. The discussions around climate change are completely different to 12 months ago. And there is an increasing discussion around how climate change is affecting inequality around the world. That said, on the ground, I don't think there's any practical change whatsoever. It's at the moment, it's a talking shop, but it's welcome. It's welcome that they're talking about this in Davos, but we're not seeing anything different on the ground.
Right. Well, that, of course, is yet to unfold, whether or not this will have any practical manifestations or whether it's just, a pure discourse. But even when we're talking about the conversation and you're saying that inequality is being talked about in relation to climate change differently than before, what for you is the main highlight there?
I mean, the main highlight in terms of inequality is people are starting to understand and to express the inescapable fact that climate change is going to hit the poorest in the world hardest and first. So that's completely unfair. It's certainly not the fault of the poorest people or the poorest countries in the world, but that is how it's going to play out. We're starting to see that already in some of the island nations like Kiribati, in Pakistan and India and across South Asia. These are some of the areas that are going to be hit absolutely the hardest by climate change. And even within that sphere, the poorest of those countries will get hit first. We're already seeing it. You can see it playing out already. The wealthy, for example, in Pakistan and India, retreat into AC apartments with air purifiers. They go from an AC apartment into a car, into an office building. They don't really feel the effects of climate change too much at the moment. The man and woman on the street, however, is suffering lung diseases. They're seeing the heat go up day by day. There's increasing illnesses being reported by the hospitals. So it's already impacting the poorest first, and that's going to play out across the world. And by the way, also in the wealthy countries,
right,
it's the poorest that get hit first.
Right. We're going to talk more about how this conversation has changed this year, if at all. I want to jump to Mr. Tangen and continue this conversation. Mr. Tangen, now 2019, the later half of it, and also 2020 as it continues, has been instrumental in terms of civilian pressure all across the world building up. There has been a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, many of it leading to the fact that there are abysmal economic conditions. Do you think all this civilian pressure is enough to change the political will to do something about this inequality?
Well, there's tremendous pressure, but what it's due to is the middle class is now rising up against what they perceive as the abuses or the excesses of the elites. You see this happening across the world. This is not something, it's simply something where a bunch of college kids are showing up at the ramparts and showing signs. They are supported very heavily by a middle class who's been long ignored, especially in developed countries. And you're seeing that kind of catch on. We see it in Chile, we see it in Argentina, we see it in Spain, in Paris, around the world, even in Hong Kong. but it's kind of misplaced. Having a rock, a sign, a sense of being cheated is not necessarily going to change the equation. And in some of these instances, instead of complaining about the real inequality, the difference in wealth, what you have is people being misdirected and aiming their vim at institutions which have actually been trying to help them, as in Hong Kong. So it's difficult to see how this is going to play out. I agree with my predecessor my colleague, when he said that this is a talk shop. I think in many ways Davos has become a kind of part of the problem. 100 billionaires are there talking about issues which affect people who could never even afford to stay in their in their wonderful mansions and ski lodges and things like that. It's a very rarefied atmosphere.
Right, but is Davos almost a mini form of the real world? I mean, it is the political elite at the end of the day who are making all these policies. Can we hope for any change if the status quo remains the same? And do we see any movement towards trying to realize or reckon with all these grievances of the 95%?
Most of the people I know are trying to figure out how they could make some money off this, and I find it a little bit disturbing. There has to be solutions. Yes, they have to be sustainable and to extent market-based. But I mean, you don't really hear much about how people are going to address the economic inequality. There's a few people in the United States who, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, who are saying, give money to charity and things like that. In many cases, these are kind of, in more instances, tax dodge. You're going to get hit with some sort of wealth tax at some point. So, I mean, the real issue here is you're going to have 1 billion people who are going to be displaced by climate change. In addition to all the statistics you just gave about the number of people who are going hungry, who are not able to even have a standard of living, this is going to exacerbate. And if it's joined by the middle class, you could see widespread economic and political dissolution. And by that, I mean you're going to see strife on the streets.
Right. I want to talk about climate change later on in the show, and what do we see unfolding in terms of real policies? What do countries seem to be taking into consideration now? But before that, I want to jump to Ms. Vicky Pryce and talk to her about another dynamic, one that was brought up specifically by the Oxfam report released prior to the World Economic Forum. Now, I'm going to read out what they said. This great divide is based on a flawed and sexist economic system. Now, to many critics of the fact that this is a sexist economy, they would say that, hey, there are more progressive policies being adopted. So why do we still see so much gender inequality throughout, whether it's in the workplace or in the economy? Has inequality become more invisible in some senses?
Well, in some ways it has, because we're all feeling quite happy and pleased with ourselves that so many people have come out of poverty because of globalization. But the question, of course, is how you spread some of that wealth around. There's still loads more people that need to be moved into, no longer being poor and needing to just spend their day trying to feed themselves and their children. There's been quite a lot of improvement, of course, in health outcomes as well for children and for mothers and so on. So that's improved, but it's still not to the point where we can be satisfied that everything's been done. That's the one thing. The system doesn't quite work that way. But what you do require is quite a lot of possibly transfers of resources from the richer countries to the poorer ones, not only accepting the issues of climate change we've just been discussing, but also the fact that unless there is serious transfer and more care taken of what happens in less developed areas, then the progress that the rest of the people who haven't come out of poverty yet can make is going to be limited. So that's one of the issues. The second thing is the way in which the capitalist system, if you like, works. Quite a lot of the issues on climate change and also inequality of women and so on cannot get properly priced into the system. So we don't have a proper carbon tax for one. And if that were to be the case, then obviously businesses will be reacting very differently. But you've also got an issue, I think, in relation to how various countries are going about redistributing any wealth, and I think that's already been touched by your previous speakers, in the sense that you don't have the right taxation, the right incentives to ensure that wealth which is created is passed rightly onto people who need it and who can then develop skills and become more productive. So the countries all lose out by having that inequality remain. And it's interesting, you also mentioned what happens in developed economies. People like Krugman, the well-known U.S. economist, has said that if inequality persists in a society, it causes all these social tensions, which means that they eventually become less attractive for investment, and therefore they go down a downward spiral. They certainly don't develop sufficiently. So a series of measures need to come. You cannot leave it just to the system. And those measures are both things that need to be encouraged by businesses, developed world, and so on, but also within countries in terms of changing the fiscal system.
Right. Mr. Einar Tangen, now as Pryce states out a pretty comprehensive analysis of what she sees is going wrong when we're talking about wealth distribution. Now, another thing to talk about, and one that I think does need a clarity, one that I would like for you to break down for us. The Oxfam report said that inequality is out of control, but according to the World Bank, we hear a lot about how poverty has been reduced to a significant level historically. Now, when we look at these two trends, they seem to be going in opposite directions. How do we try to make sense of what is happening in a global sense, in a more comprehensive sense?
Well, you have to break it down by geographics. A large part of this kind of anti-poverty claims are all based in China. China's moved a tremendous number of people, more than any time in history, off the technical aspects of poverty, and that is the United Nations, just under $2 a day. But poverty exists in other measures. And as you were quoting on the earlier part of the show, in Africa, poverty among women is of epic and tragic proportions. They spend most of their time doing routine chores like but necessary, getting water. And it does not allow them to be productive. They're stuck, in essence, being agricultural workers and child givers. And they're not given any kind of due respect or opportunity. Education is an issue, training, and thereafter, access to finance. These are all things that need to be fixed. In order to do that, though, you have to have the political willpower at the top. You see countries like Rwanda, which have broken this barrier. They have not conquered the sex equality issue, but they're making strides to it because they've been more or less independent. They have had some aid, but they have taken on the issue as one of education, bringing their people up to one of the highest levels in the country, despite having very poor resources and a very high concentration of people. So it is possible. The question is, will the Western and outside powers get out of the way long enough? And will the countries themselves have the political will to address their issues?
Right. Ms. Vicky Pryce, we're talking about the measures that have been taken for poverty alleviation now. Quoting that stark figure from Africa, which talks about 40 billion hours spent just collecting water, there is a point to be made about that, which is also that this work is mostly unpaid. And many reports suggest when women's efforts are taken into the economy, they are converted into paid work actually, they will reduce the inequality we are seeing in the world today. But is this a utopian way of thinking about things? Is this actually a practical roadmap to how this can be done?
Listen, the interesting thing about women and the time they spend doing things which are not very productive is a big, big issue, because they have to do that in various countries just to survive. And of course, if you spend all your time doing that, you don't get educated, you have no chance of having a proper job which brings your household income up, and productivity and growth in the economy suffers. But on top of that, this is a real worry. It's not just that technology hasn't really been improving in areas that allows a lot of that time that is spent to no longer be spent just fetching water, with all the impacts that that has, health and otherwise, is that there are loads of restrictions still on women's employment all across, what they can do. Your previous speaker spoke about access to finance. Access to finance for women in lots of countries in the world is still restricted. They have to get permission from their husbands or fathers to do anything, and there are jobs they're not allowed to have. And the World Bank has actually outlined that there are very, very few countries in the world that don't have restrictions on women's labor force participation, which of course impacts on their education and what they transfer over to their children and the long-term development of the country. So these areas are a must. And I think when we're looking at inequality, if you look at women's inequality, it's really significant. And that keeps countries from growing at the rate that they should and being able then to have enough resources to redistribute whatever they collect.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Ms. Vicky Pryce, joining us and taking out the time to talk to us from London. Mr. Sam Relph, now we're talking about gender equality and whether we can move towards it. What do you see being the main hindrances today? What invisible factors, visible factors do you feel like are blocking the road towards more fair wages for women, more fair conditions, and equal access to opportunities for women?
I think in many places it's a societal issue. You can educate women, you can offer them, you can educate girls, you can offer them that opportunity. But when there is a societal pressure to, for example, make sure the sons in a family gets educated first and the girls get the back seat, when there's issues around accessing finance and wages for women once they step into the world of work, and I'm talking about the poor women of the world here, particularly in South Asia, inequality is ingrained there. I mean, I was speaking to someone from the UN just a few weeks ago who was saying that in India and Pakistan now, around 80% of farmers are estimated to be women because the farms are less productive. The men have gone off frequently to cities to find other work or to other areas to find work to support the family. Those actually doing the farming and doing the manual work nowadays are women, but they can't sell their produce. So for 1 month a year, the men will come back to the farms to sell the produce, and to get the money from all of their wives' works and their daughters' work for the rest of that year. Right. So that's a societal ingrained issue. You can educate a woman to a degree, but when they can't sell their own work in a market, that's a massive issue, and that's holding everybody back, including the finances of major economies. Right. So I think that's one of the major problems. And we were talking about climate change earlier. Climate change exacerbates all of these inequalities that are already there. And one of the reasons that women are doing more farming in rural communities nowadays is because the climate is changing and farmland is less productive. So it's going to impact on issues that already exist, as one example.
Right. Of course, this is going to exacerbate issues that already exist. Mr. Einar, Tangen, now when we talk about policy reforms, the measures that can possibly be taken to tackle this inequality, do you believe that there is a political will existing now with all the momentum that is being created globally, with all the pressure, with all the civil movements? Is there a political will to actually take steps?
No, I don't actually think so. I think it's pretty much remains the same. You hear a lot of talk about it, but there's actually little action. I would warn, both my colleagues talked about the necessity of change, and while I can agree with that, from an economic perspective, you have to be very careful about bringing in what is, in essence, ideas about religious or regime change. Every country has its own culture. A lot of it has to do with the religious practices there, things like that. If you come in with this idea that the West knows better, that this is the only way to go, you're going to alienate these people. And that has been one of the impediments. You have to look at the society as it is and figure out how you can work within that box, as opposed to saying that there's a one-size-fits-all type of approach. So at this point, in terms of how things are going to happen in that area, that's why I believe it has to be within those countries themselves, where they realize that there are economic opportunities that still fit within their kind of social acceptance models.
Right. And given the model that we are existing in within, it's highly unlikely that the rich will come out and say, hey, let's start giving our money away, or let's start recirculating our money in order for there to be greater relief. They will want to sustain their fortunes given that system. Is there any other policy? Are there any policies that can help reduce inequality? Or is the circulation of wealth necessary for what needs to happen?
Well, it's not just the circulation of wealth. We're going through a time of profound change. The Industrial Revolution saw, massive displacement of people who were pushed out of the agricultural area into the cities. And technology is, in essence, having the same kind of effect. You're going to see people, drivers will lose their jobs because things can be automated, driverless cars, drones, etc. Where do they go? Increasingly, we're moving towards, in some countries, 80% of all the money spent is about choice. It's not necessity. But then you go into places in Africa where it's, 90% or more, which is all about necessity. Very little about having choices, whether it's disposable income and things like this. So there has to be a way of spreading it. A large part of that has to do with infrastructure. You would not have to have all these women running around carting water if there were some very simple, wells and some piping that would bring water to them. This could be also very effective in terms of drip irrigation and other techniques, which can improve the land. You need roads to get this produce to markets. The internet can be a great part of this in the sense that it gives access to finance. You can sell your things over the internet. You can connect with markets and things like that, and you don't have to physically sell them. So there are tools out there. Unfortunately, most of the approaches that seem to be outgoing right now are the ones where people are trying to make a buck at it. These peer-to-peer lending networks, small social groups where they try to encourage women into business. But actually, a lot of these have such high price tags on them that they render things virtually impossible on a much wider level.
Right. Mr. Relph, going back to the forum that we talked about, Mr. Tangen stated that seems to be actually the problem itself. A bunch of billionaires going to the Swiss Alps, talking about what needs to change, but really not doing anything about it. You also said that there is yet to see what will happen. But given what has happened in history, has this forum ever yielded any benefits? Has this exercise ever been productive in real sense?
I've yet to see evidence of it. I think it's a talking shop for the rich. It's where, that's the whole point of Davos. It's where wealthy people and wealthy corporations have gone to discuss how they can keep the status quo, if at all possible. I think what's interesting this year is that what's usually a genteel business meeting of the wealthy has kind of been invaded this year by Greta Thunberg. There's been members of Extinction Rebellion there. The talk of climate change is absolutely everywhere, from Mark Carney at the World Bank to the Pope. It's different this year. There does seem to be a real sense that that we need to make change, and that those who are trying to keep everything exactly as it has been for many years previously are starting to look a little bit like dinosaurs. And in some ways, literally watching the world on fire, watching their countries on fire, and denying that exists or that that's happening. So that it does feel to me like that there's a change this year, but the question is whether that trickles down. Is it just a change in what's being discussed in Davos, or is there going to be some fundamental reforms of the way that we do business around the world? Again, there's hope. I mean, Microsoft just, a few days ago, announced that they were going to be carbon neutral by, I think it was 2030, and by 2050 we're going to basically take all of the carbon out of the air that they have put into it since they were founded in 1970. What they're talking about is doing business in a completely different way. And this is one of the world's wealthiest companies.
On that point, thank you so much, Mr. Relph, for joining us from Delhi, and Mr. Einar Tangen for joining us from Beijing. It was a pleasure having you both on our show. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.